in addition to his work as in pass writing, his current position is at Manchester Polytechnic Institute, and he's been there since 1978 as a lecturer in history. One of his evening pastimes is in reading science fiction. So he spends his days in the past and his nights in the future. So now for an adventure into the Twilight Zone, Professor Stephen Davies.
Right, thank you very much. In this talk I want to talk about 5 things mainly. Firstly, who the levelers were. Who were these guys called levelers? I don't want to say too much about that, because if I do I'll be giving you a history lecture, which is not what I'm at. Secondly, more importantly, right, thank you, service and order here, what their ideas were. Thirdly, their tactics and method. How did they go about getting their ideas put into effect? How did they proselytize? How did they spread them? Fourthly, how they've been treated by historians. And in this context, I'm going to make some passing remarks about what this shows more generally about the need for libertarian historiography and rediscovery or reinterpretation of the past to conform more closely with the truth. And finally, what we can learn from the levelers. What have they got to teach us today in the 20th century libertarian movement? Now, in recent years, the British left has become very fond of finding its roots. And they're always writing things now about past forgotten groups. One of the groups they're most fond of are the levelers. And Tony Benn, for example, has made a speech called The Levelers and the English Democratic Tradition. Recently, there was a big bean feast held at Burford Church, which is a site with leveller sort of connotations, and he and Ken Livingstone were on the platform talking about how the Labour Party was the heir to the leveller traditions. And there's lots of pamphlets produced, like these two here, one by a woman called Dudley Edwards, this one by another woman called Nora Carlin. And I'd just like to read briefly what Nora Carlin says at the end. She says, "It is time that the tradition of the English Revolution was reclaimed, and it can be reclaimed only by the working class movement of today. It is a tradition," she says, "that runs from the levellers and diggers through the Chartists and the rise of the trade union movement, through popular democratic movements, late 19th century radicalism, the rise of the Labour Party, and the development of the revolutionary socialist alternative to our own struggles today." So what she and all these other people are claiming is that they are in some sense the heirs of the levellers. They are following in their footsteps, and they're putting them as a model to follow. Hopefully you'll soon realize that this is in fact brazen-faced impudence and cheek, even by the standards of people like Ken Livingstone, and that in fact what is taking place is a classic case of socialist misappropriation. Now, who then were these levellers? By the way, one point I must make clear is they didn't call themselves levellers. That was a word given to them by their opponents at the time as an insult. We just use it for convenience because it's the only name that we have for them. Well, in the 1640s in England, a little local difficulty broke out between the King and Parliament, which in 1642 resulted to actual warfare breaking out in England, the Civil War, which went on until 1647 and then broke out again for the second time in 1648 to 52. Now, this was essentially a struggle for power between two parts of the elite. It was like a gang warfare between two mafia families. And it had two effects which were not intended by the people who first took part in it. The first was that it radically undermined authority in the minds of the great mass of the English people. You're not going to have very much respect for the state, for government, or for people in power if you can see them fighting like mad and their armies are marching all over the countryside, burning your crops, taking your animals, and generally creating a great deal of mayhem and disturbance. Secondly, it led to the complete collapse of censorship. Now, until 1642 in England, the government had a monopoly of printing. It was a criminal offence to have a private printing press. All printing was done through a thing called the Stationers' Company. But in 1642, that whole system just collapsed like a burst balloon. And it led to a fantastic explosion of publishing, because publishing became overnight very, very cheap. Anybody could get into print. It was a bit like the situation Fred Stitt reckons we're going to be in a few years' time with the computers. And the result was literally thousands upon thousands of pamphlets putting forward all sorts of radical ideas. There are in fact no fewer than 60,000 of them in the Thomas and Tracts collection in the British Museum. And these pamphlets, of course, all reacted upon each other. People wrote pamphlets rebutting what other people had said, and hence, as a result of this, a radical movement appeared. A movement first in London, but it then spread outside London, in particular into the ranks of the parliamentary army. And this, primarily, is the movement that we call the Levellers. And they became one of the most powerful political forces in England in the 1640s. Why? Because having beaten the king, the parliamentary side were left with the problem of what to do next. Because the king, being a, well, to use a word that was used a lot this morning, an asshole, a fool, in other words, would not compromise. And as a result, they, victors, the parliamentarians, had to decide what kind of society they were going to have. And this is where the Levellers came up. They had, if you like, an answer, a very well worked out one. I should say briefly who some of the leaders were. The names that you find when you read about the Levellers are people like John Lilburne, who's the best known one, Richard Overton, William Walwyn, who is perhaps my own personal favourite amongst these people, other people like John Wildman, who had the most amazing career. He ended up as a double agent and William III's Postmaster General, but then we can't all be perfect. And what the point I need to make is that this movement, led by these men, had a clear programme, very clear philosophy, and it was all worked out in pamphlets, petitions, manifestos, programmes, and documents, only a mere very small fragment of which are in print. There's a fantastic amount of literature lying there in the Thomson Tracts collection, which has never been published or properly analysed. Now, what were the ideas of the Levellers, to get to the meat of my talk? They can be simply summarised under three heads: the primacy of natural law, radical individualism, and non-aggression. These all came together to form their basic political premise of self-propriety or self-ownership. All their other political doctrines sprang from this. This doctrine is most clearly expressed by Richard Overton in a pamphlet he wrote called An Arrow Against All Tyrants and Tyranny, shot from the prison of Newgate into the prerogative bowels of the arbitrary House of Lords. They just don't do books with titles like that these days. And anyway, Overton says, "Sir," I like that, "to every individual in nature is given an individual property by nature, not to be invaded or usurped by any. For everyone as he is himself, so he has a self-propriety, else he could not be himself. And on this no other may presume to deprive any of, without manifest violation and affront to the very principles of nature and of the rules of equity and justice between man and man. Mine and thine cannot be except this be. No man has power over my rights and liberties, and I over no man's. I may be but an individual, enjoy myself and my self-ownership, and not presume any further. If I do, I am an encroacher and an invader upon another man's right, to which I have no right. For by natural birth all men are equally and alike born to like propriety, liberty, and freedom. And as we are delivered of God by the hand of nature into this world, every one with a natural innate freedom and propriety, even so are we to live, every one equally and alike to enjoy his birthright and privilege." So you can see that in that passage, that rather very stirring passage, you have all these three ideas. Natural law, which is created by God, according to Overton, but he hardly mentions God, in fact, in the rest of that pamphlet. The idea of self-propriety, that people own themselves. The idea of individuals, the autonomy of the individuals being the fundamental premise of ethics. Now, what follows from this? Well, several other consequences come from this. Firstly, the one I've just said, individual sovereignty. As Overton says, all powers and rights are ultimately vested in the individual. All of them. Not, as Rousseau and other people would have it, in something called the people. There's no doctrine here of popular sovereignty. You have a doctrine instead of individual sovereignty. Secondly, all power over people exercised by the state is delegated. Governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. A government, a state, a king has only got power to make laws, to raise troops, to do anything because the people over whom he rules have freely given him, temporarily and with the right to withdraw if they wish, a portion of their self-propriety. Again, this is stated very clearly by a man called Thomas Rainborough, who was a supporter of the Levellers in the army, and on a great debate which they had at Putney Parish Church, he said, "The poorest he that is in England has a life to live as the greatest he. And truly, sir, I think it's clear that every man that is to live under a government ought first by his own consent to put himself under that government. And I do think that the poorest man in England is not at all bound, in a strict sense, to that government that he has not had a voice to put himself under." When you think about the implications of that statement, you realize they are very radical indeed. The power of governments, therefore, is limited in two ways. Firstly, what has not been delegated to them, they don't have. If the people do not delegate rights to them, the government has no right to do whatever it may be. Let us say, to give an example the Levellers are much concerned in, to determine what man's religion should be. Secondly, it is minute. The actual sphere of government power under this system is almost non-existent, for the obvious reason that the only powers that the government is going to be able to exercise are the ones that everybody, but everybody, agrees they should do. And you're going to, if you have all the people in this room, you'd have great difficulty establishing what that should be. So you're going to have, I think, very difficult to get people to agree precisely what that sphere of government is, unless you define it very tightly, very, very narrowly. So that's the second consequence. Radically limited government. Minimal state, in other words. What are the functions of the state? Well, in one of their manifestos, the so-called Agreement of the People, they said that the power of the state was for two purposes: the conservation of peace and commerce with foreign nations, the preservation of safeguards and securities of lives, limbs, liberties, properties, and estates contained in the Petition of Right, which is a sort of Bill of Rights that had been drawn up in 1626, and to the raising of monies as shall be conducing to those ends. That sounds like a giveaway, but in fact, as I'll explain later, they also had a libertarian theory of tax, so that's not as dangerous a clause as it may seem. So that's the purpose of governments. They are there purely for two things: to protect people's rights from aggression, to protect trade and commerce with foreign nations, and to preserve peace. Now, a further consequence of this theory is that law is not made by the state. One of the most important ideas that the Levellers have is the idea that law is somehow part of nature, or as they said in 17th century England, common law, i.e. common to all men and all times and places. John Lilburn was particularly keen on this. One of his great pamphlets is called Legal Fundamental Liberties, in which he says, "The true law by which men are governed is not that which comes from king or parliament or lords, it is that which is created in nature and which writes its voice in the heart of man." In other words, the idea is that law is something which is found, not made. It is not a creation of the state. It is instead the product of the reaction between human reason and the natural order, which is orderly and made to be comprehended by reason. Finally, a good society is one where aggression is at a minimum. To the Levellers, the definition of the good society was one where aggression between individuals was restrained, which was governed instead by free agreement, free contract. And this is achieved, the Levellers argued constantly, by respecting freedom. One of their main arguments was that you would never achieve a peaceful, harmonious, prosperous, or good society through the use of force or aggression or encroachment upon people's rights. Now, this was very unusual because most people in the 17th century thought that the good society was a society where your particular religious group was on top, because you knew that you were right and had God on your side. So it was screw the Catholics, screw the Protestants, screw the Unitarians, and they just used to take turns at doing this. And the Levellers' idea was, no, you must not do this at all. You must simply let people to get on with it. Now, what does this mean, this sort of philosophical program, in terms of practical politics? Now, we know about this because the Levellers were not just political theorists who wrote marvelous tracts and fine political ideas. They were also practical men. And to go to the point that Leon Lowe was making the other day, they had actually worked out a practical program to have these ideas of theirs put into effect. We know this particularly because of three main documents, which are called the Agreements of the People. The Levellers argued that the established state order in England had no legitimacy, firstly because it was not based upon the principles I've set out, and secondly because there'd been this incredible civil war. And thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people had been killed in fighting and battle, which in terms of the population of 17th century England was a lot of people. And therefore, they said, the current state of affairs had no legitimacy. The constitution was broke. Therefore, they said, the people have got to agree to a constitution for a new government, hence the agreements of the people, rather like the United States Constitution, which, if you remember, begins with the words, "we the people." It's a bit of a laugh, considering who the people were who drew it up, but never mind. Now, what was this program? Well, as I said, the first point was the adoption of a new constitution. Firstly, they wanted to abolish the monarchy and the House of Lords completely. No hesitation about that. Then they wanted to reform Parliament. You need to realise that even by this time in English history, there were incredible anomalies like a constituency called Old Sarum, which is a big hill outside Salisbury, and nobody lived in it, but it had 2 members of Parliament. And another place called Dunwich, which is a town in East Anglia. At least it was a town. It slipped under the sea. And by the time that we're talking about now, only the church graveyard was left. But those ghosts still elected 2 members of Parliament, or rather the landlord who owned the land did. So they wanted to redistribute the seats to make it fairer, so that there was a reasonable allocation of seats to population. They also believed in democracy, with certain limitations. They were not prepared to give the vote to people who are servants, living in servants or domestics, mainly for practical reasons. The problem with that was that these servants would have to vote, as they were told, and that would effectively be giving multiple votes to certain people. And also, you need to realise that most servants, in fact, left house and set up as householders when they were about 20 to 29 anyway. Effectively, what they were proposing was manhood suffrage. They also proposed a thing which I think we could really do with in Britain today, in some cases anyway, which is no re-election of MPs. Parliament would sit for 1 year, and the idea was that you could not stand for re-election until at least 2 more parliaments had gone. The idea is to prevent the emergence of a class of professional politicians. As I say, a very worthwhile cause, in my opinion. Now, furthermore, they had a great number of other things which they wanted to do. This was, firstly, complete religious toleration, which we may think is okay, but which is fantastically radical at the time. They say in the third agreement, "We do not empower or entrust our representatives to continue in force or to make any laws, oaths, or covenants to compel by penalties or otherwise any person to anything in or about matters of faith, religion, or God's worship, or to restrain any person from the profession of his faith or exercise of religion." In other words, rather like the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, complete freedom of religion, even for Catholics, which in 17th century England was, well, just not thought of. And for Jews and non-Christians as well, you may notice. It doesn't say the Christian religion. It means anybody. Secondly, no conscription. They say again that the government shall not have the power to impress or force people to serve in the armed forces, because nobody can engage in an activity where he's going to kill somebody unless he does so by his own free will. Thirdly, no arbitrary law. Laws must be passed or by Parliament or made through the courts. There must be no laws which are made in an arbitrary or unruly manner, which are unequal in their application. Laws must apply equally to everybody. They must be in English, which was a sore point in 17th century England because the law courts worked in French. These days they work in lawyerese, which is even worse. No privileges given to private corporations, no monopolies, no patents were to be allowed. Parliament was not to have the power to give special privileges or grants to people. It says that all privileges or exemptions of any persons from the law, the ordinary course of legal proceedings, or any form of patent, grant, charter, monopoly, and so it goes on, shall be null and void and shall never be recreated. This meant, amongst other things, that feudal land tenure, with its special rights and privileges, was abolished, or would have been abolished had this been done. They also had something remarkably like the Fifth Amendment. It says, "It shall not be in the power of any representative to punish or cause to be punished any person or persons for refusing to answer to questions against themselves in criminal cases." So you have effectively a Fifth Amendment. They wanted complete free trade. The relevant clause there is, "It shall not be in their power to continue or make any laws to abridge or hinder any person or persons from trading or merchandising into any place beyond the seas where any of this nation are free to trade." and it shall not be in their power to continue excise or customs upon any sort of food or any other goods, wares, or commodities, both of them being extremely burdensome and oppressive to trade, and so expensive in the receipt that the monies expended therein would extend very far towards defraying the public charges. It sounds as though they're supply-siders as well. Another one after that was no limited liability. They said it shall not be in their power to continue law whereby men's real or personal estates shall be exempted from payment of their debts. No doctrine of limited liability, which is one of the big features of modern industrial societies. No compulsory taxation. The levelers' line was that all compulsory taxes, dues, and duties should be abolished. The only taxes which would be permitted under their scheme of affairs was what was called a subsidy, and that's rather confusing. A subsidy, however, meant a kind of special once-off tax, so that the government would say, we need to build a bridge over the Thames here, and they would levy an equal tax, a flat rate tax, on everybody in the kingdom, and the money could only be used for that specific purpose. It was, however, highly limited. No capital punishment except for murder. That was another doctrine. You may know that England in the 17th century, you could be hanged for theft or for a whole range of offences, even adultery by 1647 when this was written. So no capital punishment except for murder and treason. Instead, they said, recompense should be the normal punishment. The normal form of punishment for any crime should be recompense made to the injured party. Decentralized government. All effective administration, such as it was to be done by what were called hundreds, which are small local government units, smaller than counties. No standing army permitted. No, that goes along, of course, obviously, with no conscription, but not even a standing mercenary army. Armies must be raised purely for specific purposes by buying people, paying people to fight. No central or state courts. Instead, there should be local courts in each locality. Non-intervention. No foreign intervention abroad, not even in Ireland, which again was unheard of in 17th century England. I mean, if there was one thing that almost everybody in England agreed on at that time, it was that the Irish were savages and that they deserved to be put to the sword and ravaged and burnt in any way that was possible. But they were against even that. They wanted England to withdraw from Ireland and a complete non-interventionist foreign policy to be followed. And finally, no change in the constitution or attempt to introduce communism. They specifically say that it shall not be in the power of any representative, that means Parliament, I may say, to render up, give, or take away any part of this agreement, or level men's estates, destroy propriety, or make all things common. And if anybody tried to do that, they were to be guilty of treason and subject to the punishment of death. So that briefly is their program. There were other things they wanted as well. If I went on through all the sort of good ideas I had, I'd be here at 5:30, basically. So those are the main points. Now, how did they want to achieve this? What sort of movement were they? Now, you often read, and I am afraid I have actually said to my students, that they were the first political party. Having done some more research on the matter, I think this is just not true. They weren't a political party. They were something else, rather interesting considering the kind of discussions we've been having about tactics. What would happen was that somebody, say, would read one of these leveler pamphlets, say one of John Lilburn's pamphlets or one of Overton's, and they would set up a discussion group, almost invariably in a pub, where better. And this discussion group would become effectively a cell. They would advocate the program, they would push out the pamphlets, they would give money and subscriptions to support the business of publishing and to help bail people out of jail, which is quite a frequent need, I may say. They would march and go on big processions and so on. Most importantly, they would help collect signatures for petitions. The petition became in the hands of the levelers the great educative instrument. Many of their best pamphlets are cast in the form of petitions. These petitions would be essentially very complex arguments, ending up with a list of proposals, practical concrete proposals. And these petitions would be taken round and people would be asked to read them and, if they agreed with them, to sign them. Now that did two things. One, it spread the ideas, and two, it created an organization, because you needed an organization to actually do the business of producing the petition and taking it round. And the laugh of it is that under British law, Parliament had to accept these petitions. It just had to, so they're all written into the parliamentary record. They also worked through the New Model Army. Now, this was the army which Parliament had set up in 1645, a professional standing army, and they hoped that the army would be the means whereby they could get their agreement to the people accepted. In retrospect, this may have been their critical mistake. Certainly they were outmaneuvered by the deputy commander of the army, a certain gentleman called Oliver Cromwell, one of the most devious, two-faced men in English history. A classical politician, in fact. Somebody once said of him that Oliver Cromwell, whenever he was faced with a difficulty, would pray and sigh and beat upon his breast and go through agonies of conscience and then do what he'd always intended to do in the first place. He's a bit like many people we can name, I'm sure. So what you have is a decentralized libertarian organization. It's not as rigidly structured as a party, but on the other hand, it's not a mere amorphous movement. There is some sort of organization, the discussion groups. They have their own badge, which was the sea green ribbon, which was still a sign of radicalism 100 years later, I may say. Their main activity, apart from lobbying, were twofold. Firstly, publishing. As Brian Micklethwaite said the other day, with organizations like this, it's publish or perish, and they certainly published. They turned out pamphlets at a phenomenal rate. The other thing they did was to actually do practical things for the people, particularly in London. The Leveller Party, if you want to use that word for it, became effectively a sort of self-help organization in large parts of London, which undoubtedly wanted a lot of support, obviously, because these were guys who were not only had great ideas, they also actually got things done and helped people. Now, I'm sure you'll agree that what I just described is a libertarian program put forward and advocated by a libertarian movement. Well then, how come that people like Nora Cantlin can make this claim that they are somehow the ancestors of modern socialists? Well, as I say, this is a piece of barefaced cheek. It's sheer expropriation of the past by the present. Now, I know, perhaps I'm doing what Walter Block the other day said we shouldn't do. I'm being possessive about libertarian ideas and saying, oh, how can these nasty socialists have the gall to look at these people? The thing is, if the socialists who are writing about them now actually read about the ideas and discussed them, I'd be delighted, because there would be the chance that these ideas would have an effect. But they don't. If you read the orthodox left-wing or liberal histories of the English Civil War, which describe the Levellers, you would have no idea that they are in fact a radical libertarian movement. They are described as being left-wing, populist perhaps, radical, but nothing more than that. And the actual details of the program are never spelt out. Instead, there's a great concentration upon one part of it, which is democracy, because democracy, you see, is a good thing which everybody believes in, and you don't want to raise the idea that they actually had really radical ideas, such as the ones I've listed. This leads me on to the point about general observations about libertarian history. You may think that here I'm advocating my own interest, to go back to what we were saying this morning, since I'm a historian, but certainly one of the great pressing needs of our time, and certainly of our movement, is to have more libertarian investigation of the past. Time and time again, we think that we've invented something new, and we discover that, in fact, it's all been done before. Private courts, the example. We may think that when we advocate private jurisdictions and competing courts and private police forces, that we are advocating something which is very radical, which it is in the contemporary context. But in fact, these things all existed in the past. They had private police forces in the 19th century England. In theory, they still survive, one or two of them, but they're now businessmen's drinking clubs. They're called Associations for the Prosecution of Felons, in case you're interested. This one actually exists near me, in a place called Stalybridge. And the whole way in which the past is written about by historians is terribly slanted and biased by the statist bias of the historians who are writing it. So that the basic premise which underlies most writing about European history, certainly in the 17th century, is that the emergence of strong, centralized nation-states is A, natural and inevitable, and B, a thoroughly good thing. And therefore, anyone who opposes this is a dimwit, a reactionary, and you don't write about them. And you get the kind of phenomenon that Chris Tame mentioned, where whole intellectual movements are just wiped out. There's a kind of black hole in history which eats up all these people and which distorts the whole writing of history, very often at extreme length. The classic case, which I won't describe here, is medieval Germany, which is appallingly badly written in English history. It's all about who was to blame for there not being a united German state before Bismarck. that's all they seem to write about in English. And they just blame different people. Some folks say it's the Pope, some folks say it's the princes, some folks say it's the Emperor. They never think that the Germans perhaps didn't want a central state. And if they had any gumption seeing what's happened to them since they got one, that's what they would have thought. Finally, what can we learn from these levelers? Are they relevant in any way at all to us today? Well, firstly, tactics. I think we do have a lot to learn from the way they actually went about organizing themselves and spreading their ideas. It seems to me they've got a fairly decent middle way between the organized, structured political party on the one hand and the kind of amorphous movement on the other. Secondly, many of the ideas are still relevant. I'm sure that, if a party stood today with a platform like the one I went through earlier on, everyone would say, "What extremists!" And they'd be horrified. But it would be a libertarian program. These are ideas which are still very much apposite and to the point today. One minor point is we could learn about the way they write English. One way in which I am a conservative is that the standard of the English language in the 20th century is terrible compared to the past. But the most important things, jokes like that apart, are these. 2 points, really. Firstly, that we as libertarians have a great heritage. We are not, if you like, a new growth. We are the heirs to hundreds, thousands of brave men and women in the past, not just in the 19th century, not just even the 17th century, but even before then, who have fought and struggled for liberty as people are doing today. We owe it to these people, to our ancestors, if you like, to continue that fight. And that secondly, that the quest and desire for liberty burns in the hearts of men everywhere. It's something that cannot be suppressed. Where it's suppressed in one place, it will spring up in another. In 1652, the Levellers were finally crushed by Oliver Cromwell at Burford, and their ideas went underground. But they had a tremendous influence on the American Revolution, where Thomas Jefferson actually says in a letter to John Adams that he had some of his ideas for the Declaration of Independence from, quote, the writings of those men called Levellers. They had a great influence on people like Gordon and Trenchard, who wrote Cato's Letters, which in turn influenced the Americans. They are now being rediscovered today, so that the desire for liberty is something which can never be suppressed. It's like one of these weeds I have in my garden. You think you've got rid of it, and then it springs up again. And finally, I'll leave you with a thought which comes from one, as I say, in my opinion, the best of all the Leveller leaders, William Walwyn. He was once asked what his idea of the perfect society was, and he did roughly what I've done, and he described this. And the person talking to him said, "But shall these things ever be?" And he said, "That who can tell, but yet we must attempt it." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Davies, for that very interesting, stimulating discussion paper. We still have a little bit of time, so if you have any questions, I think you'll be... Linda, would you... Oh, all right, Brian.
This is not a question to Dr. Davies, but I'd like to mention another case of historical rewriting that's going on in this country. The history of the National Health Service has been written in such a way that the role of the friendly societies before the development of the National Health Service has been almost completely written out of history. Unfortunately, somebody called Dr. David Green in Newcastle is, I think, writing a book on this subject, and it's going to present considerable intellectual material for, the discussion of the way in which the National Health Service can be privatised and a better system developed.
I wonder if you could answer a question about the modern levelers, the people who operate a magazine which went out of business recently, and they seem to be resurfacing. Do you know much about these people? I've seen their publications, typically socialist. What can one sort of do to perhaps get them to go away?
I don't know much about these people myself. They're actually what you might call anti-state socialists, is what they are basically. They're into cooperatives and green lentils and what you might call voluntary socialism, that sort of thing. As you say, the magazine went out of business recently, but I don't know much more about them than that, in fact. It's another case of people using a name in order to try and get respectability.
Were women included in the suffrage?
Now that is the interesting question. The answer would appear to be no, because they never mention it. It doesn't seem to have crossed their minds. That is one of the sad things. However, I should mention that women were very active in the leveller movement, particularly the wife of John Lilburne, who did actually present what was known as the Women's Petition to Parliament, which is printed in this book here, Leveller Manifestos by Jean Wolfe, and that actually did claim that women had equal rights with men. If they were consistent, they probably may have thought that, but one thing is they may have just not dared to mention it, because if they had, they would definitely have been thought to be absolute raving, nutcases. That's right, yeah.
One of the ways in which the 20th century levellers who run the alternative bookshop annoy people or even amaze them is by insisting on the great virtue of property, especially, and we use that word, for people who have none of it, or very little. Was anything, you mentioned a great deal about self-ownership and natural rights, and of course the relationship between the self and the state, and the roots of authority in the rights of individuals rather than the rights of people. But were they insistent as modern libertarians like to be about the usefulness and indeed the necessity for good property rights, well-defined property rights?
Yes, they were, and it's very interesting on which the grounds were on which they defended it. Property was something rather like Locke's idea, or the homesteading idea, was something which you earned by changing the world. By applying reason to alter the world, you acquired a right of property over it. What they were against was the kind of fraudulent property right enjoyed by monopoly holders.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Do they mention anything about tribunals for settling difficulties, such as trial by jury?
Yes, that's right. One of the principles which they had was that trial by jury should be the normal form of trial for everything. And in fact, they didn't want a judge except in the most minimal sense as the chairman of a court. They did not want professional lawyers. In fact, there are several, that's one of their planks, which I didn't go into because I didn't have time, which is bash the lawyer kind of plank. They wanted tribunals in the locality, in the hundreds, in the parishes, which would settle disputes between people, which would consist essentially of a jury, which would have the job of finding out what the truth of a particular case was and awarding damages to the injured party or settling amicably disputes between people.
I hope that's all right. You mentioned the common law. Yes. I did a lot of reading in what was called, or seemed to be called, the history of the English common law, particularly in connection with Henry II and that period, a much earlier period, which would be, 1100, 1200, that kind of time. And this was quite plainly state activity. There was no mixing of you couldn't pass it off as anything else. This was Henry II's imperial empire, run incidentally from France. And the only reason it was law rather than just sheer Stalinism was that, frankly, law worked better. He had a big problem keeping control over his own people, because he couldn't sort of ring them up and bully them by the telephone. He had to have rules for them. And that was really the origin of the common law. But it was absolutely statist. I mean, there was no suggestion that it was some kind of natural growth. Or if it was a sort of negotiation between the state and nature, as it were. It certainly wasn't natural. Could you comment on the meaning of the word?
That is true. As you say, Henry II created this law, and he had great trouble even controlling his sons, who kept on rebelling against him. But then what happened was that gradually the state system of courts he'd set up created this body of case law, which is what we usually mean by common law, so that an essentially statist institution began to develop and change in a libertarian direction. Also, the point about common law in the 17th century context is that in the early part of the century, a man called Sir Edward Coke, who was the Chief Justice, spelt Coke, but pronounced Cook for reasons which escape me, wrote this big book on the English common law, and it was lousy history. He completely misinterpreted the history of the English common law by saying that it was a purely libertarian thing. But this point was, this idea was accepted, and that's what the levellers meant by common law. They meant, in fact, from the bottom-up law, which reflected the decisions and practices of courts.
Yes, the interesting, if I can comment on it, the interesting thing about Henry II's system, it was a very remarkable piece of state manipulation because the one thing he didn't decide was the verdicts. It was very interesting. He decided everything else. His main rule was, you must settle your quarrels, you mustn't spend money fighting each other, you must give your money to me. That was the principle.
You had mentioned that one part of the Levelers program was non-aggression. Could you explain what their strategy was there?
Well, what I meant by that was that they defined wrong as being aggression upon somebody else's rights. That is to say, act which in some sense physically or in some other way violated people's self-propriety, to use the term that they used. This meant that they were not quite pacifists, but strongly, vehemently opposed to any attempt to impose the good society by force, because that would be imposing it by aggression, which would be a contradictory, an absurdity. There is a pamphlet called The Bloody Project, which deals with that at quite great length, which is one of Walwyn's pamphlets. Again, that is actually in print. I may say, by the way, if you're interested in these people, they are actually in print in quite considerable amount. Although, as I say, only 10% of their pamphlets are in print, that's still enough to fill several fair-sized books, which are quite easily available.
Okay, I don't see any more questions, so thank you again, Dr. Davies.